Alright, now that I got that Last of Us video out of my system, I can get back to my video on writing women, which is now even more topical since this show came out, but I'm sure nothing bad enough will happen that I can't ignore it for a few episodes to work on something else.
I'm immune. I'm pregnant.
I'm gonna talk about Spider-Man.
Adapting stories is hard. When an original story works, it's because dozens of elements have all been balanced just right to deliver a satisfying emotional punch. Accomplishing this requires a mixture of skill and luck, and depending on the medium, usually involves multiple artists making their best calls over a lengthy and convoluted process that will ultimately, hopefully, resonate with the human experience. There are ways to improve your chances of success, like maintaining constant communication between everyone involved, or utilizing the strengths of the medium you selected. But at the end of the day, there will always be a portion of any successful story that is essentially an accident. No matter how well you plan, sometimes Harrison Ford gets food poisoning and can't do the choreographed fight scene that day. So you rework the scene to be an anticlimactic gag where he just shoots the swordsman instead, and you accidentally just created one of the most iconic moments of Indiana Jones. So when you try to adapt a story that has already made it through that whole gauntlet, especially if you transfer it to a new medium, there is so much to pay attention to, because any shift in that original balance could create a completely different feeling than the original version, even if you thought you understood it perfectly, even if it was your own story. But that's the joy of it. Even though it's hard work, it's so much fun to take something that already exists and try to reflect the sensation of your first experience with it in something new. That's the art part. Unfortunately, adaptations have also turned out to be the most self-destructive thing any art can possibly be: profitable. For the last decade or so, I've been enjoying with rapidly decreasing frequency most of my favorite characters being adapted into blockbuster movies and big budget TV shows. I spent the majority of my pre-COVID 20s awaiting the next Marvel movie, going to see the next Marvel movie in theaters, and then speculating extensively about the implications it would have on the next Marvel movie. It was fantastic. I was a defender of the superhero film genre as a legitimate art form, and looking back on the Infinity Saga, I still see only an incredible, unrepeatable experiment that resulted in a multi-year shared cultural experience across the world. Not every movie was a home run, but viewing it as the most ambitious live-action superhero show ever attempted, it is mind-blowing how well it all worked. I used to frequently find myself defending things that most people didn't like, which is why it has felt very strange lately to dislike nearly everything that catches my attention. I think the corporate machinations that were at work from the beginning have finally consolidated their production process into a perfect assembly line, and they no longer need to gamble on artists to make this whole cinematic universe concept work, so there's not nearly as much room for the creativity that once made these movies so fun. So now, instead of getting excited about a new season of Daredevil, I end up forgetting that it even happened because I know without watching it that it's a shadow of anything I previously enjoyed. I just have to ignore the noise and long for a life I once took for granted. I have nothing left. Except Spider-Man. The smart thing to do would be to relate this video back to The Last of Us just enough to excuse putting it somewhere in the thumbnail, and it will certainly come up, because I grow angrier with every episode. The problem with staying topical is that I am inevitably funneled into being a review channel, but I don't want to make snarky reviews of mediocre television adaptations. I want to turn people into dinosaurs. By which I mean I want to talk about the basics of screenwriting using largely outdated media references, so today I'm returning to an old classic. You can have opinions on which Spider-Man is the best. You can point out problems with any of the movies. You can even argue that there have been far too many Spider-Men, but I will die on the hill that every Spider-Man movie consistently blows all other adaptations out of the water because they were always made by people who clearly understand and love their own experiences with that character. Being a Spider-Man fan is a lifelong commitment. I think what probably hooked me first was the 90s cartoon, and then my dad gave me some old Marvel comics from when he was a kid, and from that point on, I just wanted pictures of Spider-Man. Last one. I eventually discovered the N64 game, back when finding a game at a store felt like digging up a buried treasure because you didn't even know it existed. I grew up knowing other Marvel heroes only by their relationship to Spider-Man. I dressed up as him for 3 years in a row as a kid, including on Halloween.
Oh my god, it's freaking Spider-Man!
The first PG-13 movie I ever saw was Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, and my parents fast-forwarded through several of the Green Goblin parts because they thought they were too violent, but my life was still forever changed. With every new movie that has come out, I've wondered if this will finally be the one that fails to live up to my expectations, but that still has yet to happen. And I'm clearly not the only one. As of making this video, Spider-Man is the 13th highest grossing media franchise, completely independent of the MCU. The lonely kid who becomes a lonelier vigilante is not only a story we can apparently enjoy over and over again, but one that filmmakers almost never seem to ruin. Are Spider-Man fans just that much better at writing than other people? It would explain my genius, but I think it's probably something deeper about the story itself. Adapting anything successfully has nothing to do with the lore or the mechanics. It's not about the color of the costumes or the year it takes place. It doesn't matter if your star is Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, Tom Holland, Jake Johnson, Nicolas Cage, or Nicholas Hammond, or even a different character altogether like Miles or Gwen. It's about the emotional experience. And with Spider-Man, that always stays the same, because Spider-Man is a myth. Like, obviously he's fictional, but what I mean is he's a literal mythic figure, like Thor, or Achilles, or Jeff Goldblum. If somebody one day digs up the remains of the American Empire long after it tragically fell sometime around 2026, they're gonna assume we collectively worshipped Spider-Man as a god. And they will not be wrong. And then they'll make another Spider-Man movie. A myth is an endlessly retellable story because it not only has already worked through that whole process we talked about earlier, but it's been adapted and readapted enough times to become a simple distilled recipe. It's a set of rules that must be followed, and as long as you do, you've recreated that story, no matter what else you change. It's a blueprint, a template, and it's done. It doesn't need any further refinement. It also exists outside any medium, so it will always work the same way in everything. You don't have to be familiar with the original comic run of Spider-Man to perfectly understand how to tell a Spider-Man story. You just have to understand the moral and emotional journey that arose from its many iterations. Everything else, the surface level stuff, like the way the characters look, the way their powers work, the names of their family and friends, the logos on their costume, that's all what we call lore, and it's important to know the difference. It's Ellie's tattoo, or Joel's revolver. It's Sherlock's iconic apartment number. It's being able to do the Andrew Garfield dive and then the Tobey Maguire finger guns in the PS4 game. Lore is all the stuff on the Wikipedia page. In short, it's everything that doesn't really affect the meat of the story, but it's still important in its own way, which is why people would freak out if Superman's cape was ever orange or if Jesus was ever brown. It's the reason people get upset about casting choices. Some people really don't like it when things change color. Hollywood has got lore pretty much figured out at this point, but it didn't always. When I was growing up, adaptations of books were a minefield, and at least half the time they would change random details for seemingly no reason. And adaptations of video games and comic books were actual jokes. Even when they finally tested the waters with the first X-Men movies, they still didn't want to recreate the costumes or locations too accurately, because doing so was associated with campy, low-budget television. It probably wasn't until Iron Man and Captain America that people figured out how to dress their actors in comic-accurate costumes without making it look like literal spandex, and we could actually explore the impact of that stuff in-world. But even by 2013, we still had Superman explaining that the symbol on his chest wasn't really a big S, it was just the word hope in Kryptonian, because that's less embarrassing.
This is the symbol of my people.
Okay, well here it's an A, so either own it or change it. These days it seems like film studios, or at the very least their art departments, have finally internalized that people actually expect to see the things they came to see, and they try their best to recreate source material down to every detail. The Fallout show prioritized making every prop and costume as game accurate as possible. The Last of Us continues to nail the locations, and they reuse game sound effects and have the same composer doing the new score. Every Star Wars series tries to imitate the look of the originals, even going so far as to mix in practical puppetry for the aliens. I love seeing these things, and it's a reminder that these teams are full of talented artists who are also passionate fans of the original stories. Hell, the Spider-Verse movies are packed full of references to video games, theoretical movie sequels, internet memes, but I'd argue that most of the time, studios are overcompensating in these areas to make up for neglecting the actual storytelling. Like in Netflix's live-action Avatar show last year, they obviously cared far more about finding actors who looked and sounded exactly like the animated characters than they did about writing anything good for them to act, because they were far more afraid of being compared to the Shyamalan movie than failing to capture the spirit of the original show. Like the Shyamalan movie. We want to see the things we're familiar with, and it's great that these studios have finally figured that out, as long as they also nail the emotional stakes and core themes.
Would it make a difference if my family had hurt his people first? No.
Yep, just like that. This is the hard part. Creating those things from scratch requires a tremendous amount of love, dedication, and artistic integrity. And those things take time, and time is money, baby! So the cheat is using existing content, adapting another story. If speed is your goal, you need one of two things to still make the product good: a very disciplined writer, or an airtight original story. And a lot of productions have neither. The Last of Us Part 2, while being an innovative, emotionally authentic experience, was nowhere close to airtight. It's been incredibly controversial ever since its release. People's perceptions of it vary wildly. I personally love it, and I still think there are some issues with the way certain characters relate to the story's core themes that could have used a closer look. And, so very genuinely, I cannot think of any two writers less capable of adapting such a seminal work of art than these two delusional posers. It was never gonna go well. But what's a film executive to do? Not cash in on a lucrative IP? How can he possibly be expected to raise his own salary another several $millions and hire people who can understand the emotional framework of this year's hottest high-concept fantasy franchise? Well, that's where myth comes in, and it can help you, a normal person, just as much. A myth, in writing terms, or at least in my terms right now, is a story with a foundational set of moral dilemmas and broadly relatable emotional experiences that stay in place no matter what else changes. It's the load-bearing framework of the house you have to build before you get to decide on wall colors and light fixtures. It's all of that trial and error, the nitpicking over themes and character motivations, the pure luck of random circumstance adding something essential by total accident, all that stuff already done. It all happened at some point, but through repeated adaptations, translations, and retellings, it's been honed down into an essential formula for that story. So fundamental that it can last for centuries. Something like Robin Hood. That story goes all the way back to the 1300s, and it's been through dozens of adaptations just since the invention of film. There have been plenty of variations to the lore. Sometimes we include his origin story, sometimes he's friends with Morgan Freeman, sometimes he's a fox, sometimes a single adaptation can change or add lore that we later consider essential, like how our default image of Robin Hood's whole outfit and swashbuckler vibe comes from this one movie in 1922. Although even in his original ballads he's described as wearing a very specific shade of green. People are seriously picky about the colors. But his outfit can change. He can be an anthropomorphic animal. He can be a cyberpunk criminal from the distant future as long as each retelling has the same essential ingredients. Canon events, if you will. He has to be outlawed and set up camp on the outskirts of society. He has to gather a group of allies and fall in love with a noble. He pretty much always does that archery contest thing. He has to steal from the rich and give to the poor, or he's not Robin Hood. And he has to believe it's right. He has to be opposing a corrupt authority. He has to struggle with a desire for revenge, but ultimately choose restraint and prioritize the greater good. Because that is what works. Evolution has decided that's the best version of this story. It's emotionally honest, it makes sense, and there's nothing that inherently needs improving. And it's the same for Hercules, or Peter Pan, or Santa Claus. People can and do retell these stories poorly, but it's almost always because they try to change or exclude one of those foundational elements. Spider-Man is now one of these myths, and that is why it hits every single time. They are literally just easier to write than other adaptations because there's no risk of the story fundamentally failing to translate. When we go see a Spider-Man movie, we already know what we're signing up for. It's about a lonely young person who desires companionship and recognition and gains powers from an accidental spider-based scenario. They try to use those powers to get things they want, but then they lose someone they love because they hesitate or act selfishly. So then they vow to do the right thing, even if it costs them everything. And it does. Forever. This concept may sound limiting. Like, if the story is already done and known, why bother telling it again? Why not come up with something completely new? After all, the oversaturation of remakes is the whole problem with Hollywood, right? But I'd argue that adaptation itself is not the issue. I keep using the word experience to describe the parts that aren't lore or myth, and that's because the primary goal of any story is to transport you into it. It's to simulate an emotional state, a sensation, a decision, something you may not encounter in your own day-to-day life. Art is about trying to share our experience with other people, and everything else is just structural packaging. Writing technique is so often about how to draw the lines around your story, but it's what's inside those lines that keeps us coming back. Describing a trolley problem is not the same as watching or being Joel in the moment where he chooses one of those options. And to me, that experience is no less valuable just because those lines come pre-drawn. Every version of Spider-Man may be structurally familiar, but it's also a new experience, presented by a new group of artists. I said earlier that I used to defend things other people hated, and what I meant by that is that my favorite Spider-Man movies are the Andrew Garfield ones, The Amazing Spider-Man and The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I love them, and I think they're the best representation of the Spider-Myth. This is how I've chosen to be relentlessly optimistic while continuing to ruin your trust in my opinion. Maybe I'm expecting more backlash than I'll actually get in 2025. I know a lot of people have come around on Andrew Garfield since his appearance in No Way Home, and I'm happy to see it. But also, you're all a bunch of hypocrites. I remember the things you wrote online when these movies came out. I remember leaving the theater after seeing The Amazing Spider-Man 2 and spending 3 hours with my friend Ian reworking everything we understood about writing because of how good we thought this movie was, only to come home and see people hated it so much that the rest of the series got canceled. And then No Way Home comes out and everybody's like, oh, Andrew Garfield was always my favorite Spider-Man. No, he wasn't. Fairweather fans, all of you. I think the Andrew Garfield movies are a very grounded and honest look at the Spider-Man story. Obviously, I love every iteration. I'm comparing winning the lottery to winning the lottery on your birthday here. Tobey Maguire was a classic. These movies were so genuine and perfectly campy, and they paved the way for everything we've had since. Tom Holland really brought the whole MCU together and was a fantastic coming-of-age story. But as someone who grew up on a collection of all different kinds of Spider-Man media, including the Ultimate Comics, I think Andrew Garfield most perfectly embodies this lost, punished teenager who hides his pain with humor. People complained at the time that he was not nerdy enough to play Peter Parker, but I don't know why. He's awkward as hell. I went to high school during the time this was set, and this quiet, skinny kid who skateboarded through the school was not popular, and he really sells it. I think all of the acting is phenomenal. Gwen, his aunt and uncle, Captain Stacy, everyone brings their full effort into this, and all of the interactions feel very real to me. I love how they show him getting his powers. Someone clearly considered how that experience would feel and tried to relate it back to universally familiar sensations. Like when he comes home all sweaty and hungry and anxious. Who hasn't gotten sick, freaked out, and deliriously used Bing to look up their symptoms? The reaction to his powers is also very smug and a little vengeful at first, and it just feels very teenager. He's angry and confused, and when he finally gains an advantage, he abuses it a little. That's the Peter Parker story. That's why his uncle's death stings so much, and they make it so immediate and directly tied to Peter's actions in this one. I love the way he develops his costume over time and builds all of his own tech. I love that when he starts out, he's only interested in hunting down his uncle's killer. I love how his sense of humor just feels like a kid goofing off.
Just let me go.
Is that a knife? Is that a real knife?
Yes, it's a real knife.
My weakness. It's small knives.
I like that he's immature, that he sounds like a New Yorker, that his voice is muffled through the mask when he talks, that he looks kind of spooky in the dark. It just feels like someone really thought about being in this situation. And very little just randomly happens to him. He's constantly dealing with the consequences of his own decisions, and it all feels like Peter Parker, because the writer stuck to the myth, which means no matter how many mistakes he makes, he always eventually chooses to give up what he wants most to be the person he needs to be. The production quality in these also feels like a bit of a lost art. They have an actual stunt guy swinging down the street in one scene. They use real helicopter shots of the city. They built a whole room and rotated it with Andrew Garfield inside just to get shots of him climbing on the walls. Even when they use CGI for the more impossible shots, they work in practical elements, like in the opening of the second movie when they have a guy film the action in virtual space using a handheld camera. Rewatching the fight scenes in the first movie, there's also something extra that feels like it's just missing from all the others. Whoever choreographed these really thought about the physics of it all. Like even when he's sticking to the walls and bouncing around, you feel the weight of it. You can see how he has to balance himself and how he's thinking at least one step ahead at all times. It's super cool how he uses his webs for little things like repositioning himself to line up his next attack. It just feels so uniquely Spider-Man, like no other character could fight like this. His second movie feels a little cartoonier, mostly just through colors and visual cleanliness and this way too German scientist, but I think the tone change overall works for his development into a fully fledged Spider-Man, and they still stick with everything that has worked so far, prioritizing the experience of being Peter. This movie got lumped in with a few others at the time under the critique of having too many villains, which filmmakers clearly did not take to heart, and seems a little silly in retrospect, doesn't it? Both of his villains in this have very different roles, but they're both people who admire him in some way and then end up feeling neglected, because true to form, Peter neglects them in exchange for being Spider-Man, and is eternally punished for trying to have anything. Electro also got made fun of a lot, and I get it, he's corny, but I really liked his whole vibe. The original Spider-Man comics were made back in the 60s before mental health had been invented, and so every villain's motivation was something along the lines of, he went crazy! So seeing a version who's just lonely and obsessed and then gets shut down by his hero, and has a sympathetic, emotional reaction to that makes so much more sense. Plus the touch of using the soundtrack to give us a look inside his mind with all these dark, self-critical whispers is just super cool. There's just so many little great touches that they did not have to spend time on. And the structure of this movie made me realize how well you could fit all these things in without ruining the pacing. I remember other people have distinctly different opinions on this, and I don't remember the reasons, but to me, no part of this movie feels rushed or like an afterthought. After learning about the 3-act structure and the hero's journey in film school, this one movie highlighted exactly why those tools always felt so off to me, and led me to learn about alternatives like Shakespearean 5-act structure, which I still use to this day, and that I think The Amazing Spider-Man 2 better embodies. I also don't often see a lot of appreciation for good tragedy these days, but that's definitely what Spider-Man is. Tragedies don't have to be bummers, they're more about inevitability, like in Arcane Season 1 or in Westworld Season 1. Half the time they're about persevering even when things don't work out, and the Amazing Spider-Man movies remember that. It's a different structure and vibe than other superhero films, and I think when you're not expecting it, it can feel unfinished. That said, Spider-Man's a tragedy. I don't know what to tell you. That's what we want, to see this kid get back up and do the right thing in the face of extreme adversity over and over again because it's inspirational and sympathetic. Even Tom Holland's Spider-Man, for all of Disney's cowardice, never really gets to win one. I knew I was sold on him right after the scene in Homecoming when he gets in the car and is threatened by Batman to just leave everything alone and go back to being a kid. And then he walks into prom where his friends and the girl he's been crushing on are all ready to have the night of their lives, and he walks right past them and out the back door to throw on his homemade spider hoodie and go fight a monster in the sky, because that's what heroes do. That's not a Spider-Man one. At least that's what spider people do. They've got no chill, and it's what we're here for. And there is no greater proof of the effectiveness of this myth than Spider-Man No Way Home.
Can we rewind it back to the I'm lame part? Because you are not.
No, thanks. No, yeah, I appreciate it. I'm not saying I'm lame. I'm
But
just
it's
saying,
the
like,
self-talk.
There's reasons to dislike this movie for ultimately being a giant cash grab and encouraging other studios to lean into multiverses and nostalgia baiting, but it's objectively incredible that a movie requiring at least 7 other films across 2 decades of prerequisite viewing became one of the highest grossing movies ever just because we did all watch them. The ability to reward ourselves for participating in this giant shared cultural experience can only exist through the skill of the artists who have dedicated themselves to it and the established familiarity of the myth that it's all built on. And those same things allow No Way Home to not just be a shallow trip down memory lane, but a complete installment in the current Spider-Man story that functions just as well as the others. We get the strongest emotional arc Tom Holland Peter has had so far. Willem Dafoe brings it so hard that he becomes Tom's villain just as much as he was Tobey's 20 years ago, and there's a full tragic decline back into the lonely, unknown Spider-Man he was always doomed to be, plus a wrap-up on the last 2 guys. All in one go. By the time we get to the Spider-Verse movies, they've perfected performing this myth while just overtly referencing and playing with it at the same time. There's no reason to even elaborate. We all know. It's just amazing. As a kid, I used to watch behind-the-scenes features on DVDs almost as much as I watched the movies, and I was enamored with the scale of it. Everything that had to come together to make it all work felt so clever and out of reach. As I got older and became something of a filmmaker myself, a lot of behind-the-scenes content stayed inspiring, but in a much more relatable way. At this point, I rarely see something I wouldn't know how to do myself if I had similar resources, and it just doesn't blow me away like it used to. But occasionally, I find that rare project that still feels completely magical. Sometimes I catch a glimpse behind a masterpiece, and I feel like an awestruck little kid again because I can't fathom pulling off what these people did. And Spider-Man always feels that way. It's the gift that never stops giving. It's my childhood hero, the story I've related to more than any other, and I just keep getting more of it. It never dies, never misses, and never fails to give me exactly what I want. It is for me through and through. I am the intended audience. And honestly, I can't complain much about the other myths either. The whole MCU comes from the same repeated superhero stories, and I can take my pick of favorites. I've also always had Sherlock Holmes and Robin Hood and Master Chief and Harry Potter and a Skywalker of some description, Scott Pilgrim, Batman, Superman, every single Power Ranger, Bill S. Preston and Theodore Logan, Spock, The Rock, Doc Ock, and Hulk Hogan. If anything ever comes out bad, I can just pick a different one. They're in my movies, my TV, my video games. As a Peter Parker myself, I couldn't reasonably want for anything more, because the very myths of my society are built to reflect and validate my personal experiences. What a time to be alive. Thank God I'm not a woman or something.
We're having a baby. I mean, we and also, I guess, Jesse. I'm gonna be a dad.
It's hard to see from up close how the disparity in media representation builds up, but myth, which inherently reflects decades to centuries of collective effort, really puts into perspective whose stories get told and whose don't. I think there's been some really promising effort over the last decade or so in introducing new stories for everyone. A lot of talented artists are doing that legwork of planning and trying and taking risks until they have a story that happens to work out, and could grow into a fully realized myth someday. And some of it is pretty meaningless, like a Black Little Mermaid probably did not fundamentally alter anything, but our current Spider-Man is Miles Morales, and he's universally adored, because as it turns out, the myth still works if you change the colors. More importantly, there are seeds of untold experiences being scattered all over the place, all ready to be eventually retold and perfected and cycled into our recipe book for easy future storytelling. Things like Moana, The Hunger Games, Black Panther, She-Ra, Avatar, Horizon, or The Last of Us. But they need people who understand them to retell them in a way that actually allows them to grow. If you're a new writer trying to practice, but you find yourself bogged down by all the details of the world building and the character motivations, then there's nothing wrong with adapting an existing story as a starting point. Choosing a myth is a good way to limit your own work so you can focus on improving your skill, especially if you're just getting started. The amount of work required to write an original story can be incredibly daunting, and there's nothing wrong with building on something that already works. Adaptation is not inherently lazy, it's just a choice about what to focus on, and it's actually like the oldest storytelling tradition. Enjoying a piece of art so much that you want to try your own hand at recreating the same thing is a deeply human desire, and it's how art and culture evolve. People pass the torch down the line, and eventually what started as somebody's first draft has taken on a life of its own. The problem is that adaptations are also a much safer investment for studios. Out of the current top 50 highest grossing films, only 3 of them weren't based on an existing franchise, and 2 of those were made by the same guy. Because it doesn't matter how good they are, they're more guaranteed to make money than any original script. That means the things most likely to get funded are either adaptations of the same myths we already have, or adaptations of one of those fresh new stories early in its life that just happened to work out and catch people's attention. And since myth is pretty dominated by the stories of one type of person, that leaves only the second category for all those other experiences to slip through. And if you, say, underpay people to make an adaptation of a relatively fresh story in a different medium as quickly and cheaply as possible, chances are that it will not build well on what already works. Chances are it will be handed to someone who doesn't understand that original experience at all and isn't equipped to translate it. A promising and relatable female revenge story starring 2 teenage lesbians might get handed to, I don't know, a couple of middle-aged male producers like a self-proclaimed former sexist and his favorite lowbrow comedy writer who somehow snagged an HBO show, and you might accidentally create one of the most offensively uncanny representations of a romantic relationship between 2 women that anyone has ever seen. Neil and Craig. I went way too easy on both of you last time. There's this old idea I've heard often repeated that there's really only a small handful of stories, and every story you've ever seen is just a variation on one of those types. It's where the idea of the hero's journey and the monomyth come from, and I think it's incredibly short-sighted and unhelpful. It makes creativity feel meaningless, and I despise it to my very core. Just because there are recipes that have proven to work does not mean every single story has to follow one of those recipes, or that all of them have been found. Hero with a Thousand Faces was written as an analytical tool by a stuffy old American professor around 1950 who makes racist generalizations within the first chapter of his book. And in case you haven't noticed, there are lots of other kinds of people with a massive variety of experiences that could all be told instead. If anything, what we need are more recipes. We need to codify more types of stories into reusable myths. Remaking what works is great, but it does start to get stale when you reuse the same dozen of them over and over again, especially when they all kinda taste the same. I'll be back in a week or so with a lot more to say about The Last of Us because it's a story I love and I'm very passionate about all of this, obviously. I don't have an ad this time, so if you like these videos, please consider subscribing on Patreon, and until the next one, make more Spider-Man movies. That can't be right.